Welcome back everyone. Today I'm going to show you how to make an 8-panel welding cap. And the pattern I'm using includes 11 different sizes and it's super easy to make. So if you're new to sewing, you should have no problem following the easy step-by-step tutorial. With all that being said, grab that printable pattern and let's get started. Getting started with supplies, you need a 1/4 yard for your main fabric, and I recommend using a canvas or a denim. These are both very durable and easy to work with. Most welding caps will be made out of a canvas, so if you can find a medium weight canvas, you should be good to go. But like always, test different fabrics and find something that works for you. You'll need a 1/4 yard for your secondary fabric. This is going to be used for the lining on the inside. I recommend using a lighter weight cotton or polyester because you want it to be soft so it's comfortable and also thin enough so it doesn't change up the size. So sticking to a lighter weight material is your best bet. You'll need a 1/4 yard of very thin foam material. This is going to be used for the sweatband. I'm actually going to be using a thicker flannel material. It almost acts the same as foam. When you layer this with your lining material, you're going to get that sweatband effect. This is also optional. You don't need to add that foam core. It's mainly going to be used for comfort. If you're uncertain about this material, I'm going to get more into it later in the video so you can make your decision then. You'll need a 1/4 yard of medium weight interfacing. This is going to be used for the brim panel just to stiffen it up a bit. If you're using a thicker fabric, you probably don't need the interfacing. Again, this is an optional supply. I just wanted to include it to show you how to do it. And just in case if you're working with a lighter weight fabric, you can really stiffen that brim up so you can move it around and prevent it from being so floppy. Lastly, you'll need your pattern. The pattern is available at properfitclothing.com. It's super easy to use. All you have to do is download it, print it off, and you're ready to go. And real quick, before you print the entire pattern, there is a print size guide. You're gonna wanna take a look at that, find your size, and it will give you the exact page numbers to print for your size. It's a great way to save paper and ink. If you're unsure of your size, on the second page of the pattern, you can look at that. There's a size chart. I converted all the standard sizes into centimeters and inches. So before we get started, I'll show you how to take your measurements so you can find the correct size. And that's exactly what we're gonna do right now. So grab your measuring device and let's get started. When it comes to taking your measurement, you're gonna wanna wrap it around the top of your ears to the center of your forehead. Then using that measurement, figure out what size you are and take a look at the print size guide. This will give you the exact pages to print for your size. If you are in between sizes, I recommend going to the larger size because when you're working with canvas, it's a little bit thicker, and that can cause the cap to fit a little bit tight if you make it too small. It's just something to keep in mind when you're working with a thicker fabric. After printing out your pattern, you'll need to tape the pages together to complete the sweatband. The best way to do that is to cut off the top and one of the side edges. This will allow you to overlap the pages for a perfectly aligned sweatband. From there, you're going to tape the pages together and cut out your size. And after cutting out all of the panels and fabric, you're going to want to end up with 16 main crown panels, 8 cut out of your secondary fabric, and 8 cut out of your main fabric. 2 brim panels, both cut out of your main fabric, with the option of adding interfacing. But with the interfacing, we're going to add it later in the project. And we're not going to be cutting it to the exact shape of the brim. We're going to be cutting it bigger, applying it, and then trimming it after it's fused to the fabric. But we'll get more into this once we start making the brim. Again, this is optional. You don't need to add interfacing if you're working with a thicker fabric. And lastly, you'll need 3 sideband sweatband panels, 1 cut out of your secondary fabric, 1 cut out of your main fabric, and 1 cut out of your foam core, all cut on the fold of the fabric. When it comes to the foam, you can either use a very thin foam, or I actually swapped it out with the flannel material. It's soft and it also has a good density to give you cushion on the inside of the cap. Plus, it's thin enough not to throw off the whole size of the cap. This is optional. You don't need to add the foam if you don't want to. Moving on to assembly, the first thing we're going to do is construct the brim, so grab both of your brim panels, separate the layers. I will be adding the interfacing. Like I said, it is optional. If you don't want to add it, you can skip ahead. The interfacing I'm using is medium to lightweight. It's a great way to go to give a little bit of stiffness into the brim if you're using a lighter weight fabric. But you can still use it even if you're using a heavier weight fabric. It's also fusible, so grab one of your brim panels, place the wrong side of the fabric on the fusible side of your interfacing, flip it around to the opposite side of the interfacing, and at a low heat, press it down. The heat level may be different based on the interfacing you're using. Then go ahead and trim the interfacing flush with the brim panel. As you can see, it gave it a little bit of stiffness, but you really won't notice it until you sew the panels together and get your brim stitches in place. So from here, we can take both of the brim panels, place the right sides together, line them up perfectly, and stitch just the top curved edge at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And the goal is to do this stitch all in one go, because if you stop and start, it may add a little bit of jagged edges when you flip the right sides out. So I recommend practicing on scrap fabric before you commit to your actual fabric you're using. If you are using a very thick fabric, you may want to add notches in the seam allowance on the curve to prevent bulkiness when you flip the right sides out. And that's what we're going to do next. We're going to flip the right sides out, press it down, and see how it looks. If it's looking bunchy and bulky, you can flip the wrong sides back out, add your notches, and then do it again. It's really based on the fabric you're using. Once you're satisfied, we're going to add our brim stitches. I'm using a zigzag stitch, and I'm just going to add 4 at a 1/4 inch space apart. Feel free to add more than 4 in any style of stitch you would like. The most common stitch used is a zigzag stitch or a straight stitch. Both of these work great, but feel free to switch it up and use a decorative stitch. At this point, you can also get an idea of the stiffness. If you want to remake it with a thicker fabric or add thicker interfacing, you can do that too. But for the moment, the brim panel is totally complete, so we can place it off to the side and grab your sideband sweatband panel. Separate the layers with right sides facing up. Before we get started, you can actually adjust the height of this panel if you want to make it a little bit taller or shorter by adding or subtracting to the bottom or top edge. This will give you a custom fit, so if you like it to fully cover your ear or if you like it above your ear. And that's the beauty when it comes to making your own. You can really make it exactly how you like it to fit. But anyways, moving on, we're going to take the foam piece and place the wrong side of the foam to the wrong side of the secondary fabric, lining up the outside edges perfectly. Then we're going to fold both of the panels in half with right sides together and stitch the side edge at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Keep in mind the stitch has to be at exactly a 1/4 inch or else the circumference is not going to line up correct once we add the crown in later steps. So if it's off, I recommend dethreading it and restitching. Next, we're going to shift the panel so the seam is in the center, and what we're going to do is separate the seam allowance. This can be done by pushing down the middle so the sides separate. Flip the panels back around to the right side, double check to make sure the seam allowance is still spread apart, and what we're going to do is add a top stitch on both sides of the seam. And the reason we're doing it this way is because we want that seam to be perfectly flat so we don't feel it when we put the welding cap on. It's a little bit more time consuming, but when you're working with a thicker fabric, you'll definitely feel that on the inside when you're wearing the cap. This next step is optional. If you didn't add the foam core, you can skip ahead. I don't want these two layers to be flopping around, so what I'm going to do is sew them together to make them as one. To do this, I'm going to be using a serger. If you don't have a serger, you can use a zigzag stitch. A serger is a good way to go because it cleans up that edge and adds a nice stitch. As you can see, the two layers are joined together, and this is going to make it a lot easier once we start putting all the components together in future steps. And real quick, I want to go over the thickness of the sweatband. If you used a very thick foam, it might throw off the overall circumference, giving you a tighter fit, and that's why I chose to use the flannel because it's thin but also adds some cushion. It's best to try it on at this point just to see how it fits. But anyways, the sideband and sweatband panels are complete, so for the moment we can place them off to the side and grab all of the main crown panels. And we only need 4 of each fabric to start, so we can place the other 4 off to the side. Using the pattern, locate the front and back edge, and this is what we're going to go off to start constructing the crown. So place the right sides together, lining up the correct edges, make sure the bottom is perfectly lined up, and we're going to stitch just the back edge at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. This is another stitch that you want it to be very precise at a 1/4 inch, or else it's going to throw off the circumference in future steps. So what I like to do is quickly double check after sewing, make sure those seams are perfectly at a 1/4 inch. If everything is good, we're going to open up the panels with right sides facing up, locate the seam allowance, and you can move it to the right or the left because we're going to be adding a top stitch before we add the next panel. Then go ahead and add a top stitch to each one of the assemblies, and I'm going to be using a zigzag stitch. Feel free to use a zigzag stitch or a straight stitch. You also don't need to add it to the secondary lining assemblies. I just like the look of it, so I'm going to add it anyways. You're also going to notice a little bit of seam allowance poking past the peaks of the assemblies. Don't worry about that at the moment. We're going to be trimming that up in later steps. Grab 2 more panels of each fabric, and we're going to do the exact same thing in the same order. You mainly want to make sure you're lining up the new panel edge with the correct edge on the assembly. Starting with the main fabric, place the right sides together, lining up the correct edge. Place the remaining 2 off to the side and do the same thing for the secondary fabric. Remember to line up the bottom edge perfectly, and then from here, place a few pins and stitch at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Again, these have to be very precise, and then after stitching, we're going to go right into adding the top stitch. And I folded the seam allowance in the same direction as the first top stitch. After finishing, double check to make sure all those panels are perfectly lined up at the bottom, and the seam allowance is correct. If the seam allowance is off just a little bit, it may throw the circumference off in future steps. From here, we're going to grab our last 2 panels and do the exact same thing. Line up the correct edge with the correct edge on the assembly. So place the right sides together for the main fabric and the secondary fabric, keeping the bottom edges lined up. As you can see, the peak is getting a little bit bulky, but don't worry about that, we'll take care of that in future steps. Once you have everything pinned down and ready to go, we're going to stitch out a 1/4 inch seam allowance and add a top stitch. Once you have the steps down, this process goes a lot faster. Once again, after finishing up the stitch, double check to make sure all those panels are lined up perfectly, and the seam allowance is correct at a 1/4 inch. If everything is looking good, we're going to place the right sides together, lining up the peak in the center top and the corners at the bottom edge. Place a few pins and stitch just the top curved edge at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Take your time going over the center peak because it may be a little bit bulky from the fabric. Just like the previous steps, the 1/4 inch seam allowance needs to be very precise, so double check that before you move on. If everything checks out, we're going to move back to the peak and cut the excess fabric flush with the seam allowance. And this is mainly to reduce some of that bulk so it sits flatter on the top of your head. From here, we can flip the right sides out for both of the assemblies. Locate the seam allowance on the center seam and you can fold it to the right or the left. And what we're going to do is add the final top stitch to the crown on the center seam. It can be a little bit tricky working on that curve, so take your time. After finishing up the stitch, you'll see that it flattens the center seam out and overall makes it look really nice. At this point, both of the crowns are totally complete and we're ready to move into the next step. Grab your sideband and sweatband assembly. Using the seam as a guide on the sweatband and sideband, we're going to line it up with the center seam on the crown. And we're placing the right sides together. Move the rest of the band to the outside edge, lining up the bottom. Then place a few pins so the layers don't shift around. Repeat this process for the opposite crown and band panel. Line up the band seam with the center seam, place a pin. Move the rest of the band to the outside edge of the crown, lining up the bottom edge, place a few pins. If everything was sewn correctly, then the crown should match the circumference of the band panel. And from here, we're going to stitch all the way around the outside edge at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Try to make the stitch as accurate as possible so the band panel turns out nice and flat. Flip the right sides out and locate the seam allowance on the new seam. There's two different ways you can do this. You can either fold it upwards or downwards, and it's going to give you a different look in the end. If you fold it down, it's going to make that sweatband kind of pop up. If you fold it up, then it's going to make that crown kind of pop up. Either way works fine. It really just comes down to preference. I'm going to be folding mine down and adding my top stitch. Again, I'm using a zigzag stitch for this top stitch. I like to match my thread color to the fabric color to hide any imperfections. As you can see, the band panel kind of pops out, giving it a fuller effect. This is something you can kind of play around with and customize. Next, we're going to grab the brim panel assembly, and the first thing we're going to do is mark the center on the back curved edge. This can easily be done by folding it in half. Move to the crown and mark the center on the band panel opposite of the seam. The most accurate way to do this is mark down from the center seam. With both centers marked, we're going to place the right side of the brim assembly to the right side of the crown, lining up the bottom edges and place a few pins. Flip the lining inside out, locate the band seam, and we're going to line both of the band seams up with right sides together. If everything was sewn correctly, the two crown assemblies should line up perfectly. Comes to this stitch, we're not going to stitch the entire edge. We're actually going to leave a gap at the back edge about 2 to 4 inches so we can flip the right sides back out after we stitch. And you just need this opening big enough so you can pull those right sides out, and we're stitching at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Be sure to leave a nice back stitch at the stop and start so it doesn't rip apart when you're flipping the right sides out. Quickly double check, make sure all the layers got stitched together, and then from here we're going to locate the opening and flip the right sides out. With the right sides out, look around the outside edge, make sure everything is looking good, move back to the opening, flip the fabric inward so the right sides are together, place a pin, keep moving around the bottom edge to adjust the lining with the main fabric so that way it lines up perfectly along the bottom edge. This may require a few more pins so the layers don't shift around as you're sewing. Once you're ready, we're going to add a top stitch along that bottom edge, and feel free to add a zigzag stitch or a straight stitch. Again, I'm going to be using a zigzag stitch to match the opposite side of my band. With this stitch, you'll seal off the opening and lock the layers together along that bottom edge, so nothing's going to be shifting around. And for the final step, add your branding. I use leather strips added with double-sided rivets. This might not be the best option for a welding cap, but I thought it looked cool. You can always add embroidery or screen print. Like I said in previous steps, there's a lot of different ways you can customize this to your exact measurements. You can change up the band size, you can move those bottom panels downward. As long as you don't disturb the circumference, you're good to go with the height change. It's definitely something to consider because since you're making it, you might as well make it perfect. Also, playing around with the sweatband foam can really change up the feeling and comfort of this welding cap. I really liked how the flannel turned out on the sweatband. It's comfortable and it doesn't add too much bulkiness to change up the size. But all in all, have some fun with the project and feel free to reach out to me if you need any help. And there you have it, your 8-panel welding cap is complete. Hopefully yours turned out as good as mine did. And if it didn't turn out great the first time, I recommend trying it again, because over time you will perfect it and it will get better. Also, testing out different fabrics can play a big part in how it fits and feels. Sometimes those thicker fabrics can get bulky up top on that big main seam, causing it to be pointy and overall not fit correct. But there are ways to fix that by trimming up the bulk on the seam allowance, but just in general, using a medium weight fabric will always yield good results. And like always, I want to see what you come up with, so tag me on Instagram at Properfit Clothing, and until then, I'm going to keep the videos coming at you, so I'll see you next time.